So again, my topic, foundations of our government. All right? Oh, a couple of things. I already told you, go to the bathroom. So the bathroom's out and around. Just go down the hallway, turn left again, and come right back. Don't ever feel like you can't. And if you have any questions, I always find it better if you ask when you're thinking it. I will, at the end, ask for questions, and you can ask me then, but you won't bother me if you go, huh, because then I'll just say, yes, go right ahead. And then it's good to get that question out while you're thinking about it. Okay? That's the way I like to roll with my students. And we have a kind of ongoing conversation. And if you were my students, you'd be doing a lot more than listening to me because I'd be making you answer questions, because that's how we really learn, is when we kind of wrestle with the material ourselves. All right, so the foundation. So in 1789, the Electoral College chose the president. That's already a hint that you can tell something massively has changed, because while we have the Electoral College, you know there's an active force to try to get rid of the Electoral College in our own day. Whether we should or shouldn't, not covering that part. I have an opinion, believe it there. The Electoral College chose President Washington for the first president, first executive of our second government. Do you all know we had a first government? Hopefully you do. Stood on the balcony, made his pledge, put his hand on the Bible, unprompted. As Washington said himself, almost everything he would do would be walking on untrodden ground. So when we watched President Biden put his hand on a Bible, they were all just kind of mimicking Washington in the process. The Constitution had been ratified 11-2. We had 2 states say, heck no, not doing it. And for a while, about a year and a half, there was a lot of negotiations between North Carolina and Rhode Island. Were they going to just be independent? Unless we think that's silly, Luxembourg's smaller than Rhode Island, so not silly. And they finally were convinced to come on board. It's important when we do look at the Constitution in its history, which we're not today, you do understand that it wasn't beloved by everyone. And part of the reason why is because of this philosophical foundation we're going to kind of unpack. Now, what this did was open the door for you and I to look back and say, what is the historical context that led us to this place? Right? So one of the things that history is so good at, that I think is why everybody should love history. But I do understand if you've had Charlie Brown's teacher, and it's just dates and names and names and dates, and, as they like to say, a bunch of dead old white guys, and it's just who needs all that stuff. I concur with that. But when you understand that to understand my now, I have to gain the context of my behind, of what was before, to grasp understanding about now. Not to have the past dictate what I should do, but to illuminate kind of what the choices are and why, particularly things before my life, why they get to that point. They didn't get there randomly. They got there purposefully. I may not like the purposes that they chose to follow, but still it's kind of insightful. And we know this for ourselves. We are each individual, unique, beautiful, mysterious creations. There's never been another human in the entire history of the world, 20 billion people, who's been exactly like you at all. It's fascinating. And you know a lot of that, both scientifically and kind of culturally, that who you are as you was formed from the history behind you. And there were decisions that were made long before your grandparents were even alive that played a role in forming that. That's fascinating to me. Long before my grandparents were alive, decisions were made by people in my life that guided. In 1640s, 3 brothers got on a boat and left war-torn Central Europe and fled to the New World, landed in Philadelphia. And those 3 brothers, one of them was my ancestor. So had there not been the 30 Years' War, I might not be here. I might be in Germany, which would be great. I don't have a problem with that. It might have been bad, though, because you never know their history. My next ancestors might have lived through it. So those kinds of things kind of led us there. So what is this kind of background for them? It's important for us to keep in mind that these were Europeans who were aware of their own political construct. What sometimes happens when people talk about our governing system is they sort of, I think, act as if we Americans just beamed here from some other place and landed in 1776 or 1780. And then independently of all other context, created something mysteriously out of thin air. That's beautiful for us, and aren't we amazing? Or another key thing is a lot of times you'll hear people suggesting, in my opinion, too great of a connection to the European continent at a detriment of the connection to the British Isles. And whether we like it or not, which is okay for you to say, well, I don't like that part, a good 80-90% of the inhabitants of the roughly 2 million people in the 1770s, 1780s were of British descent. Meaning we have to always keep in mind that they are thinking in that context of what they knew from their background. They might have been aware of what was going on in Austria-Hungary. They might have known something about it. But they were not building a constitution in reflection of their history from Hungary. Does that make sense? So kind of this background. So what is the background? Well, one was they were aware of the history. When you read the founders, in fact, I was just reading the letters of John Adams, and I'm just enjoying going through his life letters. And he's in London at the time when the Constitution is beginning to be written. So he and Neil Jefferson get to contribute to the Constitution. But everybody's writing them letters. Well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And as I said, the Constitution was quite controversial. Some rock stars of the Revolution, Sam Adams, John Hancock, they openly said, Washington, Madison, you guys are committed treason. We should arrest you all, throw you in jail for being traitors. Not just kind of, you're being a traitor. I mean, like literally, you should be arrested. Because what you're doing is ruining everything we fought for. Whoa. That's not, by the way, the story we're told on most July 4ths. But it should be the story we're told, because it helps us understand when we're bickering in our own day, that sense of fighting and bickering is not new, nor necessarily just something that some current person created. But that it actually is an old legacy of who we are as a people. That's just the American way. Whether we like it or not, it's kind of the American way in the process. So they started in their minds with this idea of where did anybody think of a government of the people? Now, if you were here in January, in the historical series, we actually cheated and taught part of the idea behind it by saying, what is this idea of citizen? And in that we learned that really the first, and I would suggest only, two societies were the Athenians and the Romans, who created a society that we would say is a government of the people. And that's not the phrase they used. They used the different things. They talked in Athens of the demos having the kratos. And from the demos kratos, we get democracy. Whereas in the Romans, they believed in the things pertaining to the people, the res publica, from which we, of course, get the republic. Right? So the Latin and the Greek kind of give us these two words. They did mean fundamentally different things, and they laid it out differently. Study the history of this, you can see quite clearly to the Athenians and the Romans, democracy is not a republic, and a republic is not a democracy. Now, in the 3,000 years since then or so, things have gotten blended. There's a whole conversation to talk about as to why that's happened, and we won't go down that road. But there's a sense of very clearly for these people that there's a difference. But it was hard to hold on to. But when you look at both, there is some uniqueness, and one of the uniqueness is this word citizen, which I think is vital to understand for what the Americans are thinking, where they will go. For instance, I'm sure all of you know and may have been told a negative story of the fact that when we started, the idea of voting was tied to land ownership. Particularly today, when house prices are accelerating in a crazy manner, and we have all kinds of questions about equity, which are fair questions, and we worry, or we should worry, about affordable housing. I mean, we live in Winter Park. We live in the poorest neighborhood of Winter Park. You got a blue road sign. So if you know Winter Park, you're a blue road sign. If you don't have a blue road sign, you don't live in Winter Park. I don't care what your mailing code is, right? We live in the one spot of the city that was still kind of an entry-level housing. And just, I don't mind telling you all this stuff, we bought our house for $90,000. And now that house could be sold. We've added on to it twice, so it's a little fair. What it should be maybe $175,000 or $190,000, $500,000. No young couple can afford that. We should be worried, right, about that. So we could hear land ownership to voting, and we could hear that in exclusionary terms. That's not how they perceived it. Land was so widely available. Again, you and I know that there are people living here, the Native Americans, who are kind of maybe getting a raw deal or a complicated solution in the story, which may cause us today to go, I don't like that. Fair enough. But in their minds, they weren't rolling into somebody's teepee and taking their spot. They were going to empty land based on how the tribal peoples lived and, building on it. Right? Okay? So the Romans in particular, but the Greeks as well, would use this concept of what I call the invested citizen. Meaning, who should get to speak to decision making? Well, the person who's invested. So who has invested? Well, the person who's bought land. Why does that prove that they've invested? Because in a simple way of thinking about it, I bought land, I'm planning to live here. Does that make sense? Now, so this is, for the Greeks, it was kind of also tied to whether you could afford things for military gear. It has a lot to do with the rise of the hoplites. We covered all that a month ago, and you can look up more of that. But in general senses, the Americans, looking back to antiquity, so this kind of, what themes can I take from what they did, the foundations of the government? It was that citizenship was going to be at the core of it. Now again, you and I, or I'll just say I raised questions with them. I'm a father of 3 daughters, so I consider myself something of a pretty aggressive feminist in the sense of wanting equity for my daughters to pursue whatever they wish to pursue, right? So when I hear, women couldn't vote in Athens, Rome, or the early United States, I understand the angst connected to that. But I also don't take my modern sensibilities back in time, and I stand there and I think, well, actually, if you know the story, there actually were 3 or 4 colonies where women did vote. So it wasn't like there was we don't like women. There's a reason they make a change, which again I would find restrictive, that kind of leads to a place where only males are voting. But it was all connected to land ownership and your being able to prove you would be invested, desiring to be there. I joke with my students, I'll say something along the lines, if I ask, we're going to have a vote on whether or not to have a test or not, or what kind of test to have, and you saw me go ask all the students in the entire building, you would rightfully be mad at me because you would say they should not get to vote on what test we have in this room. And I would say, well, why? And you say, because I paid to be here. They did not. So to use the metaphor, you're a citizen of this room. They are not. They're nice people. They're maybe nice humans who live in Valencia land, but they're not citizens of this country. So only people who should get to make a decision be citizens of the country. This is their view of those things.
And this was the same at that time. Women did not inherit.
Correct.
Men.
When some of the way women were allowed to vote early was because when their husbands died and they did inherit, in some of the places they were allowed to keep it, but very seldom it was taken away from them. So this idea then, they were critical of Rome and Athens. Reed Adams in particular, he talks about the fact that they never really had an effective representative body in their system. And the Athenians never have a really effective executive in their system. So these are things where Adams and others are saying, I don't know that it's well understandable that we should mimic them directly. We should alter and improve what would make their system. But they were working from this concept. And universally, except for maybe Franklin, when you read them, the idea of copying Athens was not on their list at all. So there's a very intentionality of the American founders to say, we think Rome was the better system than Athens. So that's kind of their kind of stance of that. But again, they don't find it perfectly in the process. And in both cities, both nations, we would use the term, the system failed. They couldn't hold it together. Which I think then, for me, I think this is where I want to go. When you look historically, this is the norm. What I call the power pyramid. So everywhere you look in human society, every continent, every group, every tribal peoples, this is the system you see in the norm. That there is a pyramid of power. There's an elite at the top, almost always a single person. Again, the Spartans had 2 as their kings. The Romans had 2 consuls, but generally a sense of this one person at the top, maintaining total power. And so the bulk of the people not being included in the process. So when they looked and they said, why did they fail? I'll come back to this. The main thing that they noticed was that there was a consistent allure of power. Now, again, one of the reasons why I love history is I already told you the context. Another thing that I would say is that with history, I find I can become more grounded in my understanding of the human. So I've already told you a couple of things that I value. Right? Not everybody would necessarily value what I value. Fair enough, right? But if I hold a value position in 2022 that I wish for people that is not universally shared, I think it's beholden to me to ask myself, is my position the historical norm, or is it the aberration? If it's the aberration, while I can still urge people to come to my way of looking at things, I just think it's right for me to be patient. Even if what I perceive them doing or believing maybe being offensive to me or to harmful to other peoples. And I can say that. I think being harmful to other peoples. But still, I'm the aberration. I'm not the norm. And when you look at history, I think that we can see some very clear kind of characteristics of the human as a species. And remember, we are just part of the biological world. And so there is normative things, I think, within the human species. And one of them is this. There is a consistent allure to power. And as I tell my students, lest you be somebody critical of those in power, you know you're in college hoping you blow up big and go large and make about $1 million in play money a month to run around with. And if you did do that, you would do everything in your power to keep it that way for the full time of your life. And if you got into some position of power in a business or in a civic setting, you'd work to keep it that way. So since I'm not somebody with wealth, not in any kind of measure, and certainly nobody with power, and I can be quite critical of things, both today and over my lifetime, of the system that we are in or in situations that we're in, I do try to remind myself, well, hang on a second. But this allure to power was something that our founders were constantly afraid of. You almost have to see them in the room writing the Constitution, saying to each other, I don't trust you, and I don't trust you, and I don't trust you, and you shouldn't trust me either. And so then everything they wrote was in a sense of saying, how can I protect everybody from you? And you're thinking, how can I protect everybody from him? And in doing it that way, there's this sense of them trying to set up what we would know as the checks and balances to try to keep any accumulation of power coming. In fact, in this letter to Adams, one of the things he talks about, one of the most important things we should do, I don't think you and I would like this, is have more elections. And what he meant was there should be much greater turnover in whatever system, city, powers that we have. So like here in the city of Winter Park, we're having an election right now. Commissioners are there for 3 years. You can be commissioner for 12 years. I think John Adams would find that horrific. He would say at best 1 year and maybe 2 years in a row, period. Now there's arguments against that he may be wrong. But again, why would they say that? Well, because of this. They're afraid of those things. Okay, so then the empire fell, and we kind of make our way through the Middle Ages. You know all that, so we won't spend a lot of time there. But then by the time you get to the 12 and 1300s, something unique begins to happen. There begins to be a restoration or a recovery of some of the ideas lost from the Romans and the Greeks. And this kind of begins to raise the concept of the old Roman system. Now, nobody replicates the Greeks. Nobody replicates Athens. In fact, I would make the argument that you have to struggle to find anybody who replicates the Athenians. Even though today you'll find a lot of people claiming to be in a democracy. When you compare what they're talking about, what the Athenians did, not even close. But they do say, particularly on the Italian peninsula, maybe we can try to do some version of representative government. Now, this is all leading to what we call the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a vital thing to grasp if we're going to understand what the Americans are coming to. So you've got 1,000+ years, and if you go back to Octavian, say 1,400 years, of a system whereby the people have no voice and no agency. And then philosophically, in the late 1300s through the 1400s into the 1500s, you begin to have this idea generated, starting in Italy, rolling out to the rest of Europe, that says, hey, you know what? The human actually has value. Even those loser peasants like my people. My 3 guys who came from Germany, they were just peasant kids. So no land ownership, no value, no expectation they could do something important with their life. You'd never let those people go to school. You're not interested in them becoming educated. They're just cogs in the machine. All right, so that's my people. I'm a peasant-based people. And my grandparents were sharecroppers, so in the 1920s. So, I'm from poor stock, right? So when I talk about peasants and average folk, I'm talking about me. And the Renaissance thinkers began to say, wait a minute, even people like Kreisman, they have value. She can process. She can accumulate knowledge. He can add value. He can determine things. And from that begins about a 300-year discussion of what that looked like in government, which again in Italian city-states begins to sort of play with what did Cicero tell us? What do we know from Tacitus? What can we see in their governing system? Alongside it, or the way I describe it to my students, is the Renaissance is a revolution of revolutions. Right? And so in that process then, a series of revolutions occur in literally every field of life. And one of those is religion. So while we often talk about the Reformation as kind of an independent thing, I would say all to the contrary, the Reformation is merely a child of the Renaissance. In that within the field of religion, the same sort of thing was being asked. That if the human can process for themselves, then would it not be plausible that she can decide for herself on matters of spirit? To whom she may wish to worship, if anyone at all. Without, again, power pyramid, any controlling body or person dictating down to her. This is revolutionary, but it was what the Greeks and the Romans largely felt. And so this then began to percolate in England. Meaning, these ideas of governance only come and are seen as a kind of defining conversation in England. Now, to be fair to France, to Central Europe, to Italy, as I already showed you, the Italian city-states are going down some of these roads. And there are some theorists in France, it's in the 14 and 1500s, who are also writing in terms. But when you look at their national histories, those are never allowed to flower until after the French Revolution. So meaning after our story. So our story impacts the rest of Europe. Okay? But in England, England has a different story. Queen Elizabeth, who is, in my opinion, like the finest British monarch, and in my easy top 5 of most amazing leaders from the European story, dies in 1602. When she dies, a series of questions begins emerging from the Renaissance. Simply put, is who's supposed to rule? Who should govern? And is there a setting by which people can freely choose for themselves their own faith position without it being dictated? And this will cause a churn in the English 1600s that will lead to 2 civil wars and deeply impact our story as we go along. And introduce us to what I believe are the 2 major fundamental philosophers of our viewpoint, which is not the ones people often kind of bring up. So let's just walk through it kind of quickly. I'm not going to get too stuck in here. I might just do a whole series one time on the English 1600s. It's fascinating. So from Scotland, the Stuart family takes over the throne. They're the next in line from a simple bloodline. And they're easy to remember. There's 4 of them: James, Charles, James. You just kind of keep it little bookends. You go, oh yeah, I know how. Just 1, 1, 2, 2. Kind of work it out from there. He comes to the throne. Now, again, the Reformation is in it's kind of at the peak of effort. We're basically a decade away from the start of what arguably could be the First World War, in the 30 Years' War. That's going to devastate Europe. There's a consistent churn. The Netherlands, or the Lowlands as they would have been known at that time, and Spain, or the Habsburg family, are in the midst of their 80 years, our little 7 years of War of Revolution, 80-year Dutch Revolutionary Wars. Right? The French have just ended about 50 years of massive chaos and warfare, leading to assassinations and death. So it's not surprising that in this mix, some of the main concern was the religion. And you may know this word, the Puritans, because you go, wait, are they something to do with us? They are. In the British story, they had gone down the road religiously to create, and Elizabeth had kind of made this kind of firmed up, a system by which they were kind of a moderate blend of religion, and of current religion, so Catholicism, and some of the leanings of the Reformation. But they were avoiding the more extreme Reformation. As I joke, and my wife grew up Episcopalian, so I'm not picking on anybody. If you've ever been to an Episcopalian church and then gone to Catholic Mass, you're like, these are like the same. It's like, yep, Episcopalian, Anglicanism, it's Catholic light. It's everything Catholic without the Pope, basically. And you just go to one, you go, these are very similar. Right? That's intentional, because in the British mindset, they weren't really interested in the deep philosophies that were, kind of animating Luther and Calvin. But under the reign of Queen Mary, several religious leaders had fled the country to avoid being killed, Bloody Mary, and had gone to Switzerland, where Calvin was. When they came back, they were determined to kind of push the agenda religiously. Their critics accused them, are you trying to purify us? Because if you ever had anybody tell you something about your faith position and accuse you of being wrong, you don't like it. You get kind of bow up, and you're just like, whoa, who are you to tell me, that kind of thing. That's what they felt. Those people took that name and said, yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Well, so it was meant as a slur, they took as their name, of the Puritans. But it's best to always keep in mind the Puritans are basically Anglicans who want a more Calvinistic or stronger reform movement. They weren't separate. Does that make sense for everybody? So they're excited when because he's coming from Scotland, which was Presbyterian, and Presbyterian in the religious story is Calvinist, short version. So they're assuming he will kind of go with them and make it a better thing. He doesn't. He wants to just be like Queen Elizabeth and let sleeping dogs lie and just sort of keep it moderate, the process. He dies. His son takes over Charles. Now, at this very moment when this is going on, in France, there is a growing sense of a lure back to or to deepen that kind of power pyramid. And this we will eventually call absolute monarchy. So it's taking the power pyramid to its nth degree, that you're basically giving no voice to anybody other than the monarch himself. Well, Charles kind of likes what he's seeing in France. And he starts to get crossways with Parliament. Now, when he starts getting crossways with Parliament, one of the things that Parliament at that time had control over was if you want money, you got to get it from us. That goes back to the Magna Carta. If Charles wanted money to prosecute some wars, and Parliament didn't want to pay it. So at that time, the king was more dominant, and so he just go away. So they went away, had a group come in. They were only there for about 3 months. They're called the Short Parliament. I'll come back to this. And then he calls some other group in, and then he doesn't like what they do. He gets rid of them. They're called the Long Parliament because they will still be effectively the Parliament through the entire Civil War. But just understand that Charles, at this moment, so his years, back to here, so there was this 20-year period, 25-year period of time, Charles is kind of leaning towards government without the people. And they leave, these other two groups leave to some degree intentionally in opposition to Charles. Now I told you that the Puritans are best understood as Anglicans that are maybe, we might say, extreme or really into it, right? But there were other British-speaking, religious-minded people who simply did not like Anglicanism. And so they wanted to separate. They weren't necessarily being Calvinists, but they certainly were more intimate in their faith. And they had actually left the country. Many of these people had left the country and had gone to other places, like the Netherlands. But while they were there, they're like, you know what? Our kids are growing up with different backgrounds. We don't think we like that. So they came back to England, got a boat to take them over, a rickety boat called the Mayflower, and they sailed over. And they landed. And it's best to understand them as separatists. But you see them separating from the country because they're unhappy with the direction the king is going. Then a few years after that, some of the Puritans intentionally come. And when they come, they're very clear on what they want. And that is to prove to everyone in England, if you would just do it our way, you can see how beautiful government could be. And they make this famous sermon right when they first get there. And one of the key leaders named John Winthrop will use a phrase that becomes instrumental in understanding the United States. Particularly if you have an issue with the phrase American exceptionalism, which is not what he said, and I don't like that phrase necessarily either. He said, we're going to create a city on a hill. And what he did was he was misquoting and taking out of context something Jesus said to individual believers, but he applied it, Winthrop, to the group. That we're going to make a system that everybody should want to copy. And even if we don't make it that everyone's copy, he wants to warn you, everybody's going to watch us. So do it well. These two moments, the Mayflower Compact and Winthrop's sermon, become fundamental to understanding some of the decisions that the people made 100 plus years later. In the Mayflower Compact, they write very clearly, we're going to set up, as you can see there, a civil body politic, which meant everybody, now again ladies, I'm sorry they meant the men, but everybody here gets to decide things. And one of the instrumental parts about that that's so unique is I told you they were seemingly a pretty strong-minded religious group, but they could not afford the Mayflower by themselves. So there was about half the members of the Mayflower people coming over who we were not religious at all, but certainly were not separatists. And so when they write the Mayflower Compact, it is done, in essence, with these people who were not their religion. Intentionally say, we collectively must work together, even if we don't agree on all the particulars about faith and religion. So again, that's already early planted in the minds of our founders is what they were going to do. Well, so back in England, while these colonies are getting set up, and these are the only ones before in 1642, Charles tries to arrest some of the leaders of the House of Commons, and this leads to the Civil War. So the Civil War kind of blows up across the entire island, and loosely stated, it doesn't go well for King Charles. Ultimately, though it's messy, it's kind of back and forth, who's going to win, ultimately the Parliament will win or gain the greater control of the minds of the people. The Puritans are involved with them in this process, so most of Parliament, not all, but most of Parliament and the parliamentary leaders were Puritan. Eventually they will construct a whole new version of army, if you like military study stuff, understanding what Oliver Cromwell does with what's called the New Model Army, was instrumental in kind of changing, it's really a nucleus of what we call the Redcoats when we get to our American story later in the process. So once this goes down, Charles in 1648 surrenders, he'll be put on trial and beheaded in 1649. Now that's a massively big deal, showing that at this point, if the British citizens are believing we are no longer going to be bound by what had been historically known as kind of this divine right of kings, or the idea that the kings were given to us by God in this argument. All right? Now, at the same time, what they'll do is they'll set up a commonwealth. This actually is really important for what we do. This isn't last. This will go away in about 10 years. But what it does is it informs what's going to happen in the colonies, by which all of the 13 colonies are going to set up a version of the Commonwealth system. They're all going to have a voted-in assembly of sorts, its various types and kinds. They're all going to have participatory governance with the average person. So they're going to get all that from here, because after this, the restoration happens. I'll show you this in a slide. And every other colony after those first three are known to us historically as the Restoration colonies. So people come over post-Restoration and then post-Glorious Revolution. Now, at this moment, we get the first of these critical thinkers and writers. And you need to think of these guys as kind of the culmination of this Renaissance view. And that's Thomas Hobbes. So once the king is killed, and they're trying to think, what governance should we set up? Hobbes begins to write, and ultimately, in 1651, will write the Leviathan. Now, to understand Hobbes, and then eventually his foil, John Locke, and really the rest of these, which they were going to introduce you to, you have to see it in the sense of them asking the question of how do we understand the human? Like, who is the human? Because once, they would argue, you can identify kind of your philosophical view of the human, you then can construct a series of rules and regulations and governance structures based around that viewpoint. Okay? Hobbes and all of these guys will talk about being in the state of nature, meaning before there was official governance. And some of these thinkers we're going to look at are thinking like a tribal setting. Some are even going further back, kind of into mystical. You know, there's no real history for this, but they sort of imagine the individual living, you know, kind of with just all on their own kind of thing. In the state of nature, what is the human life? And for Hobbes, the human is not a good creature. For Hobbes, life was violent. Life in the state of nature was conflict-oriented. And he bases this around the idea that for him, the human individual is always focused on themselves. Now, some people make an error when they read Hobbes. To me, it's an error. And they say Hobbes says the human is selfish. I would suggest all to the contrary. We shouldn't use that word, because when we talk about things being selfish, we always ascribe moral baggage to that. And usually we're talking about selfish with somebody else. She's selfish. I'm never selfish, of course. But if we back up and we kind of read the full breadth of Leviathan, I think you end up saying, well, what he's saying is that everybody's focused on themselves first. And every human I've ever met, and I know myself very well, is self-focused. Now, it's all layers, right? We know people who are maybe more altruistic than others. But in general, when push comes to shove, every human is focused on themselves first. Right? You see this drive on my fork. Because of that fact, society needed to be protected. We needed a social contract that protected us. The human, he argued, would always operate in pursuit of one of three goals: competition, pursuit of safety, or glory. And out of all three of these things, ultimately it would lead to what Hobbes would say is like a state of war. Here's another place people get confused with Hobbes. They hear state of war, we think 20th century, and we think clash of nations. And I have to remind people, no, just think of the last time you got into something on social media. Last time you read through some back and forth on YouTube or Facebook or whatever. Or just think back to when you were in middle school. You've been in a state of war. You might have actually started the war. You might have been the person who said the ugly thing about somebody else. And in that moment, you were living out and enacting what Hobbes said was the natural state of the human. Now, because of this then, and this gets to the key for the founders, when you read Hobbes and Locke in particular, but I would suggest also when we read Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire, you're needing to think, where is the question of power? How much power does the governance system have? And so for Hobbes, as you can read here in this quote, there must be a power from which you are afraid of. A power that will put you in awe. Both awe like, oh, that's wonderful, and awe like, I don't want to move because what if I make the wrong step and then I'm in trouble? So that you're constantly aware of moderating your own natural desires. Your natural desires would you just be driving on the shoulder of the road past all those stupid people in line waiting for whatever's causing the hold up on I-4. That's your natural desires. Screw those people. But as soon as you're about to accelerate, you go, oh, wait a minute. What if the cops are nearby? And then if I lose my license? And then what if they impound my car? Okay, I'm just going to stay here. I'm going to self-moderate my natural inclination. Does that make sense? That's Hobbes. So he's writing this at the time of the Commonwealth and Cromwell. Another one of the mistakes people often make, I suggest, is they go back to this for a second, is that they think that he says only an absolute monarch. So they think Hobbes believes in monarchy. Well, actually, all of these people except Rousseau believe in monarchy. So to say otherwise suggests that he somehow is evil because he believes in monarchy and then everybody else is cool because they don't. Don't think about the terms. Think about the level of power. What he believes in is a strong central government. So it could be done by a representative body, he admits. He wanted a monarchy because he thought, divine right of kings, that was better. Because you and I could question Hobbes and go, if everybody's self-focused, won't the queen be self-focused? And his counter, which I don't agree with, and you may or may not, would be yes, but because they were put there by God, they'll be afraid of God, and then they'll just be perfect. And I'm like, you haven't studied history, my friend. You haven't studied the history of kings. So there's a flaw for me in Hobbes' argument. But again, he's not arguing for absolutism. He's out arguing for the most possible power to be into whatever the central government is. Got it? All right. So the Restoration happens because there's a little frustration. Again, the people in England aren't ready yet for a commonwealth. That's why it takes us another century before we can pull off what we pull off. And in the process, the sons of the beheaded guy come back. And happily for you, or unhappily, they're named Charles and James. Charles is the oldest, James is the younger. They come back. You wouldn't be surprised to find that they might not exactly be on the same page with the dudes who killed their dad. They've also lived the past 20 years in France, where, as I told you, they're building the perfect absolute monarchy. It's going to be a problem. Those two issues that they have, who's in charge, who's going to govern, and what's the religion, are going to come right back to the fore. It's almost like there's a redo. When you study this British history, you almost feel like, why did they do this all over again? It might suggest something about the human as a species. We don't really learn well, and we, again, kind of work out of our norm. But regardless, they get into it. Charles tries to make it work, but he can't kind of get there. And he finds himself defending his brother a lot. Both he and his brother James are both married and into the French families and admire the French system. Which I can understand. You guys cut off my dad's head. And I lived over there, and Versailles is kind of cool. We've not been. It's kind of a cool place. Louis's got some stuff going on. It's kind of neat. I think I would like that. So in the process, he gets to where he needs money. He gets to where he needs Parliament to do things for him. Parliament's not interested in doing things for him. He gets frustrated. And then because of religion, the leaders in Parliament, this is a political party, Whigs, not what they're wearing, they basically passed a law saying your brother cannot be king. So again, you can kind of see this tension of Parliament trying to assert itself as who gets to rule, the people or the king. And he fights back to protect his brother. We can sort of understand that. And so when he fights back, there end up being a lot of plots. I mean, assassination attempts occur in this time to try to kill either James or Charles and James. And then in 1685, as things were all coming to kind of a peak, he's out riding his horse, and his horse steps in a hole, people think probably was put there by a mole or a gopher, breaks its leg, goes to the king, he hits his head, and literally dies. And so now, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, shoot, we were working out with this guy, this is a little problematic, and this guy's going to come to the throne. And James, who, much like in the current royal family, you know who's next in line, and then you know who left to come over here, because he's thinking, I'll never be the king, right? I'm just going to come over here, right? Which is great, except, well, if something happens. Well, today it doesn't matter. But in this case, James is openly Catholic. He's like, yeah, I'm a Catholic. But I'm not going to be the king, so it doesn't matter. And now suddenly he's the king. Well, you know how this is going to go. So this time, the leaders of Parliament are trying to avoid an internal civil war. So trying to think, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? I know. And then I'll come back. We'll go to this. Here's a chart. It's kind of hard to see it. Here's James, the little crowns. Here's his son, Charles. Right? Charles has the two kids, there's more than two. Charles, James, and Mary. Right? But when James II he has two wives, right? So his first wife has two daughters, Anne and Mary. Yeah. And Mary is married off to William of Orange in the Netherlands. Great, fine, whatever, right? Not a big deal. But because their mom was a Protestant, these girls were raised Protestant, whereas the new wife is French and Catholic, and if they have a child, he'll be raised Catholic. And obviously, no offense, ladies, because these are girls, they're like, well, they don't count anyway. Right? So we've got to get to here, and we can have a son. So the leaders of Parliament are like, wait a minute, we have a solution. We have a solution that would avoid us doing something that people might consider illegitimate. We will get the eldest of the daughters, Mary, to be the queen, and that's why they appeal to William to come, and that's why the monarchy at this point is known as the monarchy of William and Mary. Mary is the third female lead monarch of the country. Mary, Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I, and then Mary. It's got to be understood as William and Mary, because Mary's really the hook, because she's the daughter of James. Believe it or not, William actually has a line back up here, but it's distant. So that makes sense for everybody?
Sure. So
we're going to have this happen. And it really comes to fruition when suddenly the king announces his wife is pregnant, they're going to have a baby. That's a whole other conversation we do not have time to get into about whether the baby was a legit baby or not. This is what this warming pan baby is. People claim the baby's stillborn. Didn't matter to the leaders of Parliament. They reach out to William and Mary, and they said, we got to make this happen.
So many nursery rhymes came
Yes, absolutely. That is exactly right. So, now this is known as the Glorious Revolution. It's also casually known as the Bloodless Revolution. It's bloodless because James does not fight to defend his throne. Surprisingly, he runs to France. I think he was hoping King Louis XIV of France would help send an army. He doesn't want to get involved, so James runs away. It's from the Bloodless Revolution. And William and Mary are put on the throne. Now, in this moment, Parliament steps in with one of the most critical things for our government, in that they will make a declaration of right, singular, that becomes known as the Declaration of Rights. And then if you Google it today, you'll find more people calling it the English Bill of Rights. If you ask them in 1689, they'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about, Bill of Rights. What's a Bill of Rights? But we call it that because of our own first 10 amendments. It's really effectively the Declaration of Right, or you can call it the Declaration of Rights. And so they basically take the stance of, we are inviting you. So you, King William and Queen Mary, are under us. So that question of religion the question of who's going to rule is settled in their mind. And when you look at the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Rights, it's going to look very familiar to you, or it should look familiar to you, because they start listing things that our founders found valuable to be explained and enforced. So this is not all of them, But this is the one that, again, I'm not going to read them to you because you can read them and you can see kind of, oh, those look very, very familiar. But when you think about the things that are in our Bill of Rights or are assumed in our system of governance, you can almost always go back to the Declaration of Rights of 1689 to find its foundation. And for the revolutionaries of 1765 to 76, this last part is really kind of important. Their view was, and it's embedded in the Declaration of Rights, it's not explicitly stated like I'm stating it here, but it's embedded in there, that by taking the oath of allegiance to the king, I am not a bad citizen if later I rebel against what I perceive to be tyrannical steps in which you have violated these things. I wanted to be very clear, in case there was doubts, revolutions are now okay. But this becomes vital to understand the Americans, because in our mindset, I tell my students there's 4 founding themes. We don't have time to get in all of them, but one of them that's kind of core to our DNA, which if you just think about the past 5 years, you should go, oh my gosh, I see it now, is that we rebel against anything we perceive to be unfair or unjust. And we do that often by marching in the streets. We do it often by taking up arms. We do it often by attacking people. Tar and feathering was an open act of terrorism. It was not that much worse than anything the Klan ever did. The Sons of Liberty are actually our very first terrorist organization. They use terror for political means, which is what terrorism means. Right? And so when you see these things, you go, wow, I may not like that. I'm kind of a law and order person. I don't own a gun. Not personally. It's not my thing. I don't really want to own a gun, kind of a thing. Right? But when I see people marching in streets and doing things, and we've seen a lot of it, right, past decade, my first thought is, good for them. Those are good Americans, because that's what America does. That's who we are. And because of this, one of the things you find out happening in the earliest days of our colonization is, as peasants, we rebelled and we won. And when you go back and look at Bacon's rebellion, the rebellion of the Paxton Boys, all the way through, you see this beginning to really build in the minds of the Americans, not just that can rebel, other peoples have rebelled, but that we're going to win. Now, in the 20th century, we can look at lots of rebellions Americans have done that maybe haven't worked out the way that they wished. But that idea of rebelling comes all the way back to this. You're not a traitor to the system if you think somehow rights have been abridged. Now, again, that's always part of the conversation, right? I think you've abridged my rights. No, I didn't. And we have that conversation or that screaming match with each other. Hopefully it's not the latter. But you see my point. I'm not saying that you have to agree that this has been abridged. But when it's been abridged, I'm not bad if I take action against you because of it. That's their viewpoint as they're going forward from this moment. So Parliament finalizes their control by passing a series of laws, which would previously been something you cannot imagine. These are average people. This is the moment when the House of Commons really becomes dominant. Up to about the 1650s, the House of Lords, which is the nobility, were dominant. The House of Commons was kind of just a throwaway. And of course, you know, the British government today, the House of Commons is all the, the House of Lords is there, but you never hear them on BBC. You never talk about those guys. It's the Prime Minister and the House of Commons, what they're deciding. It's almost like they have a single house. They passed these acts, which are just 3, but they're 3 biggies, particularly the Succession Act. We will dictate to the monarch who the next monarch will be. It won't just be by bloodline. Meaning Parliament could say, you know what, Queen Elizabeth, we're glad you're still on the throne. We've decided we don't like Charles. We want the kid who's in America. They could do that. It'd be shocking. It'd be controversial. But by the act of succession, they have the right to do that. So this idea then is not to specifically look at those things, but to see Parliament taking authority. This gets us to Locke. So Locke then is writing at the time of the Glorious Revolution. Hobbes writes at the time of the Civil War. Locke writes at the Glorious Revolution. In Locke's view, the human, opposite of what Hobbes thinks, is actually naturally good. Generally will do okay with their neighbor. It's kind of like you're in this room right now. If you got up to leave and go to the bathroom and you had your cell phone and you left it on the chair, Hobbes would call you an idiot. Pick your phone up, you never know. And Locke would say, you don't need to worry about that. Leave it for her, ain't nobody gonna bother her. Now, where you fall on that continuum is your own position, right? I have my own too, and nobody's able to say you're right or you're wrong. But just understand it is that continuum about governance connected to one's view of the people. At the time that they're in London and Paris, Adams and Franklin write each other. And Adams says to Franklin, you are more afraid of the individual, I'm more afraid of the crowd. So loosely stated, Jefferson's with Locke, Adams is with Hobbes. You can't trust people, therefore you need a governance of serious rules and a significant amount of power in the governance. Jefferson's like, you can trust people, they're fine. The government should do nothing. Later, Jefferson and Hamilton will have the exact same argument. And Hamilton will say, a good government is a government that's energetic, active, doing stuff. Hamilton would be very happy today. Jefferson retorts, no. A good government is a government that governs the least. In essence, it's as if it's invisible. Like the only time you should see your government is when you go to the post office. That's the only time. So Jefferson will be horrified today. Right? So kind of keeping that in mind, you understand the difference between Locke and Hobbes, right? Now, again, he stated nature also, by the way. They both do this. In his mind, the social contract then coming out of this sense of a civil society is connected that there is a desire for the people to have protection of their natural rights, which are what? Life, liberty, and property. Now, this issue of property is where we're going to get him divided from Rousseau. You never want to have central power accumulate in the central government. Too much power accumulating in the central government, according to Locke. You want limited, very limited power. Government only exists. I mean, Locke would acknowledge, okay, there are some people who might do that. Right? So we do need some rules. We need some sense of governance where they vote together on things. But the people can decide this together themselves in that process. Government coming from the people. Another way to think about it, this becomes one of the core questions that the founders deal with. Is government us, or is government them? I think today we'd probably say it feels like it's them. And even if it doesn't matter who you vote for. Right? Hobbes would agree, government is always them. The power needs to be not amongst the people because you can't trust the people. Locke would say government can only be us. If you find your government, Locke would argue, that has become a them, then you have lost the government. And then he, along with the English Declaration of Rights, would say you have a right to rebel. Because the government is no longer your government. The government has lost its way. You need to fix it because it has gone away. Now, Locke's influence will be greater, massively greater, than Hobbes. But I would offer to you to understand the foundations of our governing system, both the Constitution itself, but then the rest of everything that comes with it, all the other trappings. You have to understand Hobbes as the counterweight. It's as if you're playing a video game and you get to be the god for the government. You're setting up a colony on Jupiter. You get to decide. You're moving a lever. You can either have more of Locke or more of Hobbes. You can't have both. If you're going to go more to Locke, you're going to have less of Hobbes. Less power in the government. So no government would tell you. In a Lockean world, I'm a mass person. Right? So just so you know, I'm only up here because I'm election you guys. Right? So I'm double vaccinated, Jackman. But in Locke's world, no government would dream of telling you have to wear a mask. And Locke would say, you have no right to do that. I have right to my liberty. So you can't do anything about it. That's what Locke would say. Right? Hobbes would say, we're going to tie all y'all down. Everybody's getting shot today. You don't like it, we'll just throw you in jail. Then you'll still get a shot. That's Hobbes. Just a modern example. But Locke's influence is greater. And it's important to understand kind of how, when you look at both the Declaration and the Articles of Confederation, our first government, how those are completely Lockean documents. All right? Now, this leads us to the Enlightenment. Now, here's where I probably differ very deeply from most of my peers who would tell you about the United States government. In my opinion, most of the people you would talk to lean so heavily on the Enlightenment. And they typically are talking about continental thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau. And I would offer all to the contrary, that these British citizens living in the New World were only aware of Montesquieu. They weren't really thinking about Rousseau at all, because he's their contemporary. He's writing at the same time the revolution's really happened. So they don't care about Rousseau. And I'd say most of that is a late addition, because if you talk to most historians, they think the Enlightenment's God's gift to humans. And I would argue all to the contrary. The Enlightenment is merely an extension of the Renaissance. And I think I can win my case in a good argument with any historian when you look at the historical context. Be that as it may, the Enlightenment was important because it does give us this more thinking about it. As they're rolling out this constitutional monarchy, again, you have to recognize this is massively unique. Nobody's doing this, which is why I typically will tell them about the revolution. We rebelled against the most liberal, free government in the world. We were economically the strongest of all the colonies. You were richer if you lived in North America than if you lived in England. And you were freer than any other human on the planet. And we were like, yeah, we can do it better. And that's a whole other conversation, but understand this is massively unique. And everywhere else you looked, it was the old system, the power pyramid. Everywhere else you looked. So then, as the English were rolling it out, and as these thoughts of the Renaissance had really began to percolate, certain thinkers began to be, we would say, enlightened. And really they would start doing and saying, wait a minute, what else could we do? And when you look at the idea of the Enlightenment, it is kind of arguing against authority, right? Which is fair. That's what we saw the British doing. Arguing against the old system of authority. And they begin to argue also coming out of the Renaissance, which one of the Renaissance's children is the scientific revolution, to say that we have reason. And again, the human can think for herself. She can process. In that setting, then, you ought to be able to think just logically as to what would be good systems. We don't have to merely say we got to do it this way because they did previously. It's good. Their champions and their heroes are Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke. All children of the Renaissance. And all three, you can look at them as almost kind of culminations of where the Renaissance goes in the issue of philosophy, although obviously I know Descartes would be here with him. Science, Newton, and philosophical governance, Locke. And so they're saying this is what we should want to do. Education is really important in the process. They're all thinking in terms of what was the previous, or the state of nature, and what should we do differently. And they all love England. They're all like, this is what I wish we lived in. And so, these writers, you know them, right? What you may not know, though, is that there's actually a more influential group of thinkers who are in Scotland. And the Scottish Enlightenment becomes far more important. Another reason why I'm kind of critical of my friends who are like, Enlightenment, that's what led to our government. No. Think about just the British Isles. Right? Now, the differences are not really instrumental for us, so I'll just go ahead and go on from here. Voltaire, he's kind of the champion. He's like the granddaddy. He's the first one we kind of look to. All these men, and there are actually some women thinkers. Wollstonecraft is a good example. There's others who, if we were doing a talk on the Enlightenment, we would spend time on. So all we're really doing is thinking in terms of influence to the United States, so just so we're clear. And so they all write more than the things I'm showing, right? So Letters on the English Nation, Voltaire, early on, 1726, is coming out saying, hey, the English have got a good plan. They've got a system, we should do this. He's writing at the time, obviously, Louis XIV and Louis XV. So this premier sense of the kind of absolutism at the very pinnacle of what it could look like. And so he's saying, that's not good. It's not good for a lot of reasons. And so he's suggesting that the French should copy the British. He's followed by Montesquieu. Montesquieu writes Spirit of the Laws 20 years later or so. And when he's writing Spirit of the Laws, he now does a kind of scientific review of kind of what's gone on before. And he, I think, arguably makes one of the most critical contributions to philosophical thought about governance, in which he says, the only way to defend ourselves from too much power accumulating anywhere, which is the natural bent of the human, will be to separate those powers. All right? Now, one is interesting is this. He thought perhaps it could only work, or maybe, when you read him, it's hard to tell, maybe work best in a very small setting. That'll be a problem for us, because our setting's not small. When we start, it's not small. And the potential is that it would get much bigger, as you know. Then Rousseau. Now, Rousseau I almost don't include, but I need to, because everybody knows Rousseau. And so, because he's writing very late, right? We've already begun our journey to the American Revolution. He's not influencing us, right? I don't think we're influencing him, but nonetheless, they're kind of parallels. Rousseau is the kind of the fly in the ointment for Montesquieu, Voltaire, and the others. He doesn't like any of those guys. He comes out and attacks those guys. And he's the one who really, particularly with his writing Social Contract, begins to make an argument against Locke. Because for Rousseau, the problem that ruins society was property. And once you introduce private property into the system, you automatically introduced inequity. And that's what ruined things in the state of nature. This is why for Rousseau, his solution is not what you're told it is. People will often tell you, oh, he wanted democracy. When you read Rousseau, or at least when I read Rousseau, he wants anarchy. Now, don't hear anarchy in a terrible frame of mind. I tell my students, fascism, communism, democracy, republic, anarchy, these are merely words describing governing systems. They are, to me, amoral. We can historically look and say, oh, wow, every place that one's been tried, it's gone bad for people. I don't want to live there. We might can then suggest that perhaps there's some flaws in the structure. But if we could avoid the morality views, how we consider them, I think it makes us better observers of the system. So he's saying basically Locke is right, and Locke just didn't go far enough. People are good. Just don't give them any property. Let them exist in the state of nature, and you never need any governance at all. There's simply no need for governance. Now he admits the likelihood of this is limited. Ergo, if pressed, okay, fine, okay, you got to have some governance, then it must be the Athenian democracy. And remember, with the Athenians in democracy, this should tell you all you need to know about our government, our system, not even our current government. In a democracy, all the citizens vote on all the issues all the time. There's no issue, nothing too minor that all the citizens don't conclude. We're all in the boat together. We all vote on everything. And, in case you aren't aware, I'm sure you're aware of this, we're alive at the first time in human history where we could be a democracy. So we could do that. All we got to do is get an app on our phones, get a government-issued phone or something, and then we could be a democracy. You wouldn't have a president. You wouldn't have Congress. You wouldn't have any of that stuff. You'd have some civil servants maybe up there doing stuff, but you just have a system. That's where Rousseau wants to go. As you can imagine, the only one of these guys who says no monarch, he's the oddball. Now, when you get into the 18th century, into the 19th century, you do see Americans resonating with Rousseau, and over the length of the 19th century, you will have more and more people in America and in places like England and France who are going to call on Rousseau for justification for where they go. When you look at the Paris Commune that emerges during the French Revolution, for instance, they're calling on Rousseau. Right? But initially, for our founding, he's not as big of an issue. Now, Scotland. These are the ones you don't know quite as well. We've got to go quickly. I always get too far behind. I'm so sorry. Francis Hutchinson, and we'll come back. And this guy, Lord Keynes, he's Henry Home, but he's called Lord Keynes. These are like the grandfathers or the fathers of the Scottish Enlightenment. Now, one of the important things to recognize with the Scottish Enlightenment is that they believed faith and reason could work together. Almost all of these people, not all, but almost all the great writers are church people. Some of them are pastors, and they're also all educators or involved in education. Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen, which was the location of the three greatest universities, become like the center of the Scottish Enlightenment. Because the English system is so effective, none of their writings is necessarily about how should we restructure government. They all write on how do we understand the human. And in that understanding of the human, that will lead to potential alterations that should happen within government. But you don't find any of their writings centered around government, but much more about understanding the human. So for Hutchinson, who's influenced by Shaftesbury, and when we see politeness, you and I think of one thing, but what he's thinking about is how we treat one another is indicative of the Lockean view of the goodness of the human. And so we should be striving to be refined, would be a way that he looks at it. So when he writes, all of his writings basically come down to this idea that if we allow people to find their happiness, they will flourish in that goodness that Locke suggests. In other words, we need very limited government to do things to refrain people, because if everyone's operating in their happiness, no one will be impinging upon anyone else. Again, with all these guys, there may be arguments formulating in your head, like, well, I don't believe that. I may agree with you, but just as kind of where they were. But Keynes is like the lead jurist of the time. Imagine, think of him like our Supreme Court Chief Justice, that kind of a thing, for Scotland. Not surprisingly, he kind of disagrees with Hutchinson because he believes law is vital. He's not with Hobbes. In fact, you can look at Hutchinson as basically being someone who wanted to write to consistently refute Hobbes. So Keynes is sort of a foil to Hutchinson, but he's not all the way where Hobbes is. Keynes becomes actually very important for Madison, because Madison is going to be influenced by Hume, and Hume is influenced by, or is mentored by Keynes. So he agrees that we are self-focused. So therefore you need the law in order to protect the group. That ultimately, if pressured, the individual's own pursuit of happiness, he was speaking to Hutchinson, has to be moderated, and I don't believe you would moderate it yourself. So we're going to have laws in there to kind of self-moderate or to bring moderation, whether you want it or not. Ergo, we will have a speed limit, and we will give you a ticket if you go over it. Of course, they don't anymore, but you know the idea. His greatest student, Keynes' greatest student, is David Hume. Both Hume and Adam Smith are men who are influenced by both Hutchinson and Hume, because Scotland's pretty small, so you're not surprised about that. Hume comes very close to siding openly with Hobbes, in that the problem is the human. And he makes this shocking statement that we can, so this is a kind of interesting thought related to the Enlightenment, that you can never trust your reason, because we are always overrun by our own passions. So again, that self-interest, self-focus thing that he's talking about. Again, this is challenging for someone like Montesquieu, who would have been like, wait a minute, because again, particularly on the continent, they are thinking. But so would have Hutchinson and Hume. They would be like, wait a minute, I don't know if that's what I believe. But that's the road he goes down. Now what's interesting then is he says, but we can take these passions and we can reshape them. And we reshape them through, say, institutions. So a classic example is, ladies, you know this to be true, I'm sure. Most men are thinking about sex every 5 seconds, and the ones who claim they are probably doing it every 2 seconds. That's the joke, of course, about it, where that's the way it is. But the male is often driven by passion of sexual nature. So you moderate that by having an official governing institution called marriage. And by doing that and locking it down, and at that time having rules against, like laws, you break the law if you had sex in some capacity outside of the bonds of marriage. I'm not saying they enforce those laws, because we know that adultery and all kinds of things would have been true then as they are now. But his idea was we want to try to help the individual. Same thing with like accumulation. He would say, we know people are going to want to accumulate possessions. So instead, you give them the functional structure of business by which they can accumulate and then use that for the benefit of other people, while, of course, they still are making wealth. So that's where Hume goes down the road, and we must understand that liberty needs law in order to be safe. We can't have liberty, Locke, Rousseau, Hutchinson, just independently. There must be some authority. So you see in Hume kind of moving the lever between Locke and Hobbes and trying to find a middle ground that does bring in some law. When Madison makes the argument we must have a stronger government, which he will, as you know, he's really channeling Hume. He's thinking about Hume. Madison was schooled in the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, and that's the road he's going down. I think this is the last one, Adam Smith. Smith is perhaps the most famous on an economic sense, but he actually would tell you his best book he ever wrote was this one, Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now what Smith tries to do, and many people think he does effectively, is balance Hutchinson, happiness is all things, with Keynes, law is necessary. But he does it in a way that argues against Hume. So he saw Hume as kind of his consistent foil that he's going to argue. He does agree that passion is there, but he thinks the individual has a deep desire for approval. And so as I act on my passions, if I see those bring disapproval in your eyes, I will change, like instantaneously. And he would say that is what the role of the conscience is. The conscience then becomes this thing that does moderate, but not self-moderate. He almost suggests that the conscience is an independent entity. Now, again, all these except for Hume from Scotland are strong Christians. So is Locke and Hobbes. So you always have to keep in mind there is this Christian foundation behind the things they write and think. Right? So he's suggesting to some degree that the conscience will speak to you from, in essence, God, based on your relationship with others. For Smith, the interdependence is vital. And this really speaks to what our founders were arguing or thinking about when you talk about the Mayflower Compact, civil body politic together, or even the idea of sitting on a hill. We're going to operate together to create a society that's emulatable. Right? So we're kind of looking in this regard. And this is, just to skip ahead, is why you get to his writing on Wealth of Nations, which is, I think, famous and often misunderstood. And so he kind of builds from that spot. If your happiness is interdependent on the observation of others, and if you need both law to balance the authority, so Lord Keynes, but you're allowed to pursue your happiness, when you extend that out to the things you do with your daily work, where is your passion and skill? That you invest your time there in your passion and skill, even at the lack of doing the other. So metaphorically, you may not be a good farmer or a good seamstress. So instead of you trying to make the clothes for your family or make the food, what are you good at? I'm good at pottery. All right, so then you make the pottery that we need, and you do it very well, and you do it pursuing excellence. If you do that freely with no bounds by law to limit you, then you will be excellent at that, and you will make money at that. And that's a good thing in Smith's mind. But you will then also benefit, to use an example, all the other people who don't make good pottery. They'll be able to have good quality pottery because you made it. And then you have something that they can need. So the idea of capitalism, as Smith understood it, meant a deep interdependence of individuals working at their excellence. Now, obviously, industrialism in modern 20th century takes us in a whole other part of the conversation that Smith was not a part of. In fact, if you keep reading, he acknowledges that individual excess, leading to what we would say robber barons or kind of monopoly, is bad. He did not actually agree with laissez-faire. He never said that government should make no laws whatsoever, which is what the French kind of argued that he was the right way to go. See him as saying a Lockean version of limited power. But again, there's a lot of things you and I could critique Smith or critique capitalism about in the 21st century. And trust me, my wife's heard me do some of those critiques when I bring in my inner Stalin and just want to kind of deal with some things. And but that's not where Smith's at. All right? So Smith's kind of not going there. And so this is interesting when you kind of put it in motion. Now, let me wrap all of this up. I promise we're done here. So when you look then, these thinkers have an impact on colonial America. These writers are suggesting things that the colonists are imbibing as they live out the 1700s. Literacy is, I think, the highest in the world, in the New World, but it's certainly very high. So they're reading these thinkers and these writers. The average person is. When the Massachusetts colony created a constitution for itself, John Adams basically wrote it, they sent it out across the whole state. And they talk about how loggers and lobstermen and casual people, men and women, would read it and then come back together, and they got hundreds of alteration suggestions sent back into with the guys who were writing the Constitution, and imposed them and made them and put them into edits and this kind of stuff. And the point was, all of Massachusetts, not just the wealthy elite, could read, think, and process, and they were honored in that process to be allowed to. All 13 colonies were, as I said earlier, creating a system by which they kind of were mimicking what the British were doing. Hence, when we do our government, even though it takes us 2 tries, we have 2 attempts, we find ourselves being more successful than the British Commonwealth. Well, that's because we had 150 years long training wheels to kind of work it all out. We get that influence from these other thinkers from Scotland, William Tennant, John Witherspoon. They'll be among those who are influencing. Tennant helped set up the Princeton in Princetown, New Jersey. Witherspoon will be the president of Princeton. He'll influence Madison, influence Burr. These guys are part, as you see, at the writing of the Declaration of Independence. almost half of the signers were from Scotland, were Scottish influenced people. The word common sense, who you know, comes from Thomas Reid. He's one of the most influential writers from Aberdeen. And he kind of believed that one of the things was a problem with Hume was the fact that it didn't acknowledge the human does have this capacity for self-reason. And so for him, he argued it was that we all have a common sense by which you could understand things. Later, as you probably know the term, right? Common sense is what Thomas Paine will use, and he'll have that from Reid, basically. Benjamin Rush, here you see, kind of tells him of this. And the influence on the Constitution itself from these guys, for instance, James Wilson will be a student of these guys, and he'll be the one who really wants to argue that we definitely must have a judicial branch. So when you study the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention, they were back and forth on how much power it had the judicial branch. And you know they didn't really flesh it out, because when you read the Constitution, it's the one section that is the barest. I mean, Articles 1 and 2, there's all this stuff. And then for the Constitution, for the judicial branch, it's kind of like, yeah, we'll have a Supreme Court of the land, and it'll do judging stuff. Which is why Marshall is the one who's going to introduce a judicial review and flesh out things about the Supreme Court. All right, recap. Hobbes, Leviathan, human self-focus leads to conflict, so we've got to have peace with an all-powerful government. Hobbes, 2 treatises of government, right? There's a social compact to protect property, finding the public good for all people. So the government will do this with less power. Montesquieu, spirit of the laws, we're going to have to divide government into separated pieces in order to keep power from accumulating. But once we do that, it can shape the laws. And then Rousseau, who again I would suggest has the least influence, at least in the creation of the government. Maybe we don't need property at all to be protected. Maybe that's not where we're going to go. And you can see then when you compare how they each thought of the human, right? So again, the human, they're equal, but they're equally aimed at conflict because of self-focus. Whereas with Locke, people are good. There's this general sense of goodness, and God, has given us these rights. They're never relinquished. You always have them. It has nothing to do with government. Government comes from us. Montesquieu, well, they're fearful, but they're too timid, actually, to have conflict. And Rousseau, well, we're very free, we're happy, we're peaceful. And as long as we don't let inequity in through property. Well, because of that, then, the social contract. Right? Ooh, the screen got all weird. Sorry. I'm having trouble with the projector. You're going to lay down your rights with Hobbes to a central government. Locke, government is consented by the people. It is only us. And it definitely will protect the public good with a limited number of laws. In particular, protecting your right to property. Looping back to that idea of invested citizen. Montesquieu, again, the only way the social contract is protected is if we divide power in the system. And Rousseau, again, we really don't need any government at all. Leave us alone. If you leave us alone, I'll leave you alone. We'll go home happy. So then the government that they wanted, again, restating, single power, all the power in the central government. Limited power, very limited, but no judicial system necessarily. Government power, including judicial, separated. Rousseau, if pressed, will go to a democracy, but like Hobbes, power in one body. If you had to have power, so the government, the people, we'd say with the people, it's good. It's still all in one power. So, our experience, we'll write a declaration, very Lockean. Immediately after that, we'll set up a group of men who were at the Second Continental Congress to write a government. They'll write the Articles of Confederation. It was not a flawed government. It was not a failed government. It was exactly the government they planned to write. So as you think of the constitutional story for the rest of our system, or the rest of our year, or as you do your own reading, you hear people attacking the Articles as if they were messed up. In my opinion, you're hearing somebody who does not know the history very well, or they're coming at it with a bias on the front side. I don't think I would have wanted to live in the Articles, so I can see reasons that I find them not good enough in my mind, but they're precisely what they wanted to set up. And the argument that they will make, the defenders of the Articles, as I told you, is claims of treason against Madison and others. But within a decade, nationalists like James Madison will say, hey, wait a minute, we have a problem here. We aren't effectively creating a single nation. And that is really one of the core questions, because none of the colonists, and certainly none of the 13 colonies, even in 1780, were thinking we actually have come to construct a single nation. They came to construct what they did construct, a confederation of united states, using state as, they would have said the state equals what we call nation today. Remember, nation doesn't really exist at this point. Nationalism is a 19th century concept. So when they say United States in 1783, we would probably better understand it as the United Nations of North America, kind of a thing. But again, for Madison and others, John Adams, who I love, they're like, no, we need to be one nation, effectively together. If you know your story, by the way, you can see this battle all the way through the Civil War. Because today we say the United States is at the Olympics. The United States singular is doing this. Up until Reconstruction, it was always plural. So it would have been the United States are at the Olympics. The United States are potentially going to war with plenty of people. So they always saw it kind of as equal status. So we're going to keep digging and thinking, the American experience really is the American experiment as they're wrestling with how do we put these ideas into motion together. Well, I appreciate you guys being here. Again, I'll hang out. Hopefully you come next month. The next month's on Rome. So the second Saturday in March, it'll be on the Roman Empire.